The night at Fairmont Crest was tense, almost unbearably so, as the air crackled with secrets long buried and revelations poised to fracture every relationship that had been built over years of manipulation and hidden motives, and at the center of it all stood Tomas, whose usually calm demeanor had given way to an intensity that made even the most composed residents of the crest tremble slightly in anticipation. Because Tomas had discovered something so shocking, so earth-shattering, that it threatened not only to upend the fragile alliances within the gates, but also to reveal the darkest corners of human deceit, the kind of revelation that could make even the most seasoned schemer pause and reconsider every move they had ever made. And the object of Tomas's revelation was none other than Hayley, whose carefully constructed facade of innocence and loyalty had been so convincing that few had dared to suspect her true nature, and yet, with the precision of a surgeon and the moral resolve of a man who could no longer bear to see his friends and family manipulated under false pretenses, Tomas laid bare the truth that Hayley was, in fact, Val, a name that carried with it a legacy of deception, betrayal, and an agenda so meticulously crafted that only someone with years of experience in deception could have pulled it off. And as he spoke, every word dripping with both anger and a reluctant sorrow at the necessity of the exposure, the room seemed to shrink, the walls echoing. The weight of the accusation as Bill, normally the unshakable pillar of logic and authority in Fairmont Crest, found himself paralyzed, unable to form coherent sentences, his mind racing through a lifetime of interactions with Hayley, trying desperately to reconcile the person he had thought he knew with the sinister truth that Tomas had just revealed, and each glance between the residents seemed to carry a mixture of shock, fear, and disbelief, because the implications of Val's presence in their midst were staggering. Every alliance, every whispered conversation, every manipulated encounter now demanded reconsideration under the harsh light of truth, and even as Hayley, or Val, as she now had to be called, stood poised, unflinching, perhaps even proud of the performance that had carried her this far, her eyes briefly flickered with something unrecognizable. A hint of vulnerability that suggested even the most cunning predator is not immune to the human consequences of exposure. And Tomas, sensing both the weight of the moment and the fragility of the fragile social fabric of Fairmont Crest, continued his revelation, recounting the subtle manipulations, the half-truths, the whispered schemes that Hayley had executed over the past months, painting a picture of a character so complex that admiration and revulsion coexisted in every listener's mind, while Bill's shock slowly morphed into a churning mixture of anger, betrayal, and incredulity as he grappled with the realization that someone he had trusted implicitly, someone who had woven herself seamlessly into the very fabric of his life and the lives of those he loved, was in fact an entirely different person, someone whose motives had never been aligned with the communal good, but instead with a carefully hidden agenda designed to destabilize, to manipulate, and perhaps to take something far greater than mere control over Fairmont Crest. And as the revelations continued, the tension in the room became almost physical, a palpable force pressing down on everyone present, as each listener had to reckon not only with the truth about Hayley/Val, but also with the unsettling question of how deeply the deception had permeated their own lives and decisions, and the reactions were as varied as they were intense. Some residents instinctively recoiled, unable to process the duplicity in front of them, while others, more analytical, tried to piece together the implications, weighing past events through this new lens of reality. And in that moment, the true genius of Tomas's exposure became clear. Not only had he revealed Val's identity, but he had also forced the entire community to confront the fragility of trust and the dangerous power of appearances, because if Hayley, the seemingly loyal friend and ally, could harbor such a secret, then perhaps everyone had been operating under illusions of safety and understanding that no longer held any validity. And amidst all of this, Bill finally found his voice, though it trembled with disbelief and an edge of anguish, his words faltering as he addressed both Tomas and Val, trying to make sense of what he had just learned, grappling with a cognitive dissonance between affection and suspicion, loyalty and betrayal, and the audience, watching from the edge of their seats, could almost feel the internal earthquake shaking Fairmont Crest to its very foundations, because beyond the immediate shock, the revelation carried implications for the future, for the alliances and enmities that would define the coming days, weeks, and months, and as Tomas concluded, emphasizing that the truth could no longer be ignored or swept aside, the room fell into a heavy, almost suffocating silence, broken only by the faint, controlled breaths of those who were still trying to process the enormity of what had just transpired, and Val's expression, carefully measured, conveyed both the calm confidence of someone who had planned this revelation from the shadows and the faintest trace of apprehension, a silent acknowledgement that while the mask had held for years, now the real test of power, influence, and survival was about to begin, because in Fairmont Crest, truth is never just a statement. It is a weapon, a catalyst, a force that reshapes destinies and tests loyalties, and Tomas, having executed his moral imperative with precision, stepped back, his gaze sweeping the room, understanding that while the moment of exposure had passed, the reverberations would echo through every conversation, every plan, and every relationship in the community, and as the residents exchanged tentative glances, whispered speculations, and hard stares, it became painfully clear that nothing would ever be the same, that the revelation of Val's identity had not only shattered the illusions of trust, but also set in motion a chain of events that would test courage, morality, and the very essence of personal loyalty, and as Bill struggled to reconcile the duality of his emotions, stunned by the truth, yet compelled to act, to strategize, to protect the people he cared for. The scene drew to a close with a lingering sense of suspense, anticipation, and the unspoken understanding that in Beyond the Gates, every revelation is a doorway to chaos, every secret a potential weapon, and every character a mixture of shadow and light, capable of love and deception in equal measure, and as the camera panned across the stunned faces, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. One thing was certain. Fairmont Crest would never again be a place of certainty or simple loyalty, because with Val unmasked and Tomas's courage on full display, the delicate equilibrium of the community had been irrevocably disrupted, promising a future filled with schemes, heartbreak, alliances, and betrayals more intricate and intense than ever before, and the audience, gripped by every moment of emotional intensity, knew that the drama unfolding was only the beginning. A prelude to the storms of revelation, retribution, and redemption that Beyond the Gates excels at delivering, leaving viewers not only shocked and breathless, but also utterly captivated by the intertwining threads of truth and deception that define life behind the gates, because in this world, as Tomas so heroically demonstrated, the line between friend and foe is razor-thin. Identity is fluid and dangerous, and the revelation of a single truth, Hayley's true identity as Val, can ignite consequences that ripple through every heart, every mind, and every secret corner of Fairmont Crest, reshaping destinies in ways that are unpredictable, unforgettable, and utterly compelling. And as the stunned silence lingered in Fairmont Crest, Tomas's revelation that Hayley was in fact Val seemed to reverberate far beyond the immediate circle of witnesses, because each resident, from the youngest who had only just begun to understand the tangled web of alliances to the seasoned players who had thought they had seen every form of manipulation imaginable, suddenly recognized that their understanding of the social order had been catastrophically incomplete, and even as Bill struggled to regain composure, his mind raced through every interaction he had ever had with Hayley, trying to reconcile her charm, her apparent loyalty, and her persuasive influence with the dark cunning Tomas had now exposed, and each memory now flickered with new, troubling context, from seemingly innocuous conversations that were clearly tests of loyalty or ploys for information, to whispered instructions that, in hindsight, had been carefully orchestrated manipulations, and while some residents instinctively recoiled, sensing danger and betrayal in ways their conscious minds hadn't yet processed, others, more strategic or more hardened by previous deceptions, began quietly analyzing how this revelation could be turned to their advantage, because in Fairmont Crest, Knowledge of a secret like Val's identity was both a weapon and a shield, and those who could act quickly might find themselves in positions of power they had only dreamed of moments before, while those who reacted with fear or indecision risked being swept aside, manipulated, or worse, collateral damage in the unfolding battle of wits and willpower. And in the midst of this, Tomas felt the immense weight of moral responsibility pressing down on him, understanding that his exposure of Val was not just a personal victory, but a communal necessity, because leaving her secret buried any longer could have allowed further manipulation, betrayal, or even harm to be carried out unchecked. And yet, even as he stood with a mixture of pride and trepidation, he was acutely aware that in revealing the truth, he had also ignited a powder keg of tension, suspicion, and fear, because Val, now unmasked, was not the type to crumble or submit quietly. Instead, she would analyze, adapt, and retaliate with precision, turning the very act of exposure into yet another stage in her strategic game. And the room seemed to hold its collective breath, knowing that the next moves would be decisive, dangerous, and likely irreversible. And as Bill finally found his voice, it came out raw, tremulous, and tinged with a desperation born not just of betrayal but of the gnawing fear that his judgment, his trust, and perhaps even his legacy had been undermined by someone he had considered a friend, a confidant, and a reliable ally. And as his words stumbled, faltered, and clawed toward coherence, the reactions of the other residents varied dramatically. Some gaped in shock, unable to believe that the person they had accepted as part of their community, someone they had celebrated with, mourned with, and argued with, could harbor such a secret. Others furrowed their brows, calculating, weighing the potential ramifications of Val's unmasked presence, considering which alliances could be strengthened, which enemies neutralized, and which opportunities exploited, because in the world of Fairmont Crest, revelation is rarely a moment of pure morality. It is a battlefield in which every detail can shift advantage, expose weakness, or confirm dominance. And even as these thoughts churned beneath the surface, Val herself remained unnervingly poised, her calm and measured expression a mask perfected through years of experience, her eyes glinting with a mixture of defiance, cunning, and perhaps a trace of admiration for Tomas's courage, acknowledging that while the exposure had revealed her identity, it had also, inadvertently, highlighted her skill, her meticulous planning, and the terrifying precision with which she had navigated the treacherous social landscape of Fairmont Crest. And yet, even her composure could not mask the subtle ripple of uncertainty that Tomas's revelation had triggered, because no matter how brilliant a schemer, being exposed before a room of allies and potential enemies changes the rules entirely, forcing rapid adaptation, strategic recalibration, and the potential for dramatic, even catastrophic, consequences. And as the residents whispered among themselves, eyes darting, minds racing, the unspoken question hung in the air. What now, and who among us can still be trusted? For if Val could manipulate, deceive, and conceal her true identity for so long, what other secrets lurked behind the carefully constructed facades that everyone presented to the world? And Tomas, sensing the undercurrent of tension, frustration, and awe, knew that while the revelation had been a necessary act of honesty, it had also set in motion a chain of events that would ripple through every corner of Fairmont Crest, affecting friendships, romantic entanglements, business dealings, and even family bonds. Because in a place where every action is interconnected and every trust is fragile, the exposure of one truth can topple mountains, unravel centuries of assumed loyalty, and ignite conflicts that had been dormant for years. And as he watched the stunned, calculating, fearful, and curious expressions of those around him, Tomas understood that the drama, chaos, and emotional upheaval were only beginning, because Val, now unmasked, would not simply accept defeat. She would strategize, manipulate, and retaliate in ways that would test every resident's cunning, courage, and ability to read the shifting tides of power. And Bill, finally shaking off his initial paralysis, realized that he would need to act decisively to protect the innocent, to navigate alliances, and to anticipate Val's next moves. For in Fairmont Crest, the revelation of a secret identity is not an ending. It is the spark that ignites a blaze of intrigue, revenge, and unrelenting drama, and as the night deepened, the tension in every room, every hallway, and every hidden chamber of Fairmont Crest thickened, promising conflicts that would test the boundaries of morality, loyalty, and love, because in a world built on appearances, the truth is both liberating and terrifying. And as the residents faced the new reality that Tomas had unveiled, each one silently vowed, in their own way, that the game had changed forever. The stakes had grown immeasurably higher, and the battle for control, trust, and survival had entered an entirely new, electrifying, and dangerous phase, because now everyone knew the truth about Hayley, Val, and nothing would ever be the same again in Beyond the Gates, where every secret revealed is the beginning of a new, high-stakes drama, and every revelation carries consequences far beyond the imagination of those who witness it. As the revelation of Val's true identity continued to sink into the minds of everyone in Fairmont Crest, the room seemed to pulse with a tension so thick it could almost be cut with a knife, because Tomas's words had not merely exposed a lie, they had shattered illusions, rewritten histories, and forced every individual present to confront the terrifying possibility that everything they thought they knew about loyalty, friendship, and trust was now suspect. And even as Bill struggled to gather his thoughts, attempting to reconcile the warmth, charm, and loyalty he had believed Hayley embodied with the cunning, manipulative, and meticulously calculated persona of Val that Tomas had so courageously revealed, his chest tightened, a combination of disbelief, anger, and grief threatening to overwhelm him, because each memory of shared laughter, strategic partnership, and tender moments now shimmered with a sinister undertone, revealing itself to have been carefully orchestrated, potentially weaponized moments designed to ensnare, manipulate, or mislead. And while some residents instinctively recoiled, their instincts screaming at them to retreat, to reassess, to safeguard themselves against a threat they had never imagined being so close, others, with sharper minds or perhaps darker inclinations, began to consider not only the ramifications of Val's unmasking, but also how they could leverage the situation, because in Fairmont Crest, knowledge is power, and Val's exposure, while devastating on a personal level, was also a strategic opportunity for those who could act quickly, decisively, and without hesitation. And as Tomas stood back, his expression one of somber triumph tinged with apprehension, he knew that while he had delivered the truth, the battle for Fairmont Crest's future had only just begun, and that every glance, whisper, and gesture in the room now carried far more weight, a subtle calculus of allegiance, suspicion, and potential betrayal that would define the coming days, weeks, and perhaps months, because in a community where the line between friend and enemy is razor-thin, every revelation is both a weapon and a test. And as the realization of Val's meticulous deception began to unfold in everyone's mind, it became clear that the implications were staggering, touching not only the personal dynamics between individuals but also the very structure of power, influence, and trust within Fairmont Crest. And while some, like Leslie, who had always possessed an innate instinct for reading people, immediately began tracing the hidden threads of manipulation, piecing together the subtle signs that Tomas had noticed but others had ignored, others, like Danny, felt a creeping sense of vulnerability. The recognition that even her most intimate secrets, alliances, and strategies could have been quietly observed, exploited, or weaponized by Val for months, perhaps even years. And this realization sparked a mixture of fear, determination, and a silent vow to never allow herself to be so exposed again, because in the world of Beyond the Gates, survival is not merely about strength or courage. It is about foresight, vigilance, and the ability to anticipate every possible deception, a lesson now brutally, inescapably clear to all present, and even characters who had previously been peripheral to the drama, like Ted and Carlton, felt the ripple effects, their minds racing as they reconsidered alliances, motives, and the hidden hierarchies that had governed interactions within the community. And as whispers began to circulate, eyes darting, gestures loaded with new significance, the tension escalated, almost unbearable, because while Val had been unmasked, her presence alone carried power, influence, and the threat of retribution. And the question of what her next move would be hung over everyone like a dark cloud, an unspoken challenge daring them to act, react, or risk being outmaneuvered. And even as Bill struggled to organize his thoughts into a coherent strategy, he realized that the consequences of inaction would be catastrophic, because Val was not the type to remain passive, to accept exposure as defeat. She would plan, calculate, manipulate, and strike with precision, and every relationship, every secret, and every alliance was now a potential weapon, a piece in a high-stakes game whose rules had shifted irreversibly. And as Tomas's gaze swept across the room, he observed not just shock and fear, but also the subtle stirrings of strategy, the faint glimmers of ambition, and the quiet determination of those who had survived countless intrigues before and would now do so again, because in Fairmont Crest, no secret stays buried, no alliance is permanent, and every revelation is both a test and an opportunity. And as Val's expression remained calm, measured, and almost eerily confident, she too was calculating, assessing, and plotting, because while Tomas had revealed her identity, he had also inadvertently provided insight into the perceptions, fears, and weaknesses of everyone present, and in her mind, each reaction was a variable, each glance a clue, and each whispered murmur a piece of information to be stored, analyzed, and deployed when the time was right. And even as the weight of the moment pressed down on the residents, the room seemed to vibrate with unspoken tension, a prelude to storms of confrontation, retaliation, and emotional upheaval that were certain to follow. And as the night stretched on,